Let's say that the way we conduct this course is we will assign you, I mean, all the issues about the assignment along the semester. So we will assign you a kind of topic. You need to work on it. You need to prepare a presentation, and the day of the presentation it's a kind of a random thing stuff. I mean, so we will call you here to present, but in a random way. Okay? So you need to be prepared anyhow, anyway, and of course we won't teach you. We will assign you a grade, or of course affect then the final grade. Okay? So whoever is not in a group, of course you have time within tonight, but please let's avoid to receive emails. I'm sorry, I didn't find a group, because you have all the afternoon here, okay, to manage this issue. Then, group composition, the groups should be composed by 10 members. Of course, if you are 9, if you are 8, it's okay. The important stuff is more or less that you are maximum 10 members, okay? Of course, we love if the group is mixed. I mean, you have here also international students. So if, try to avoid, I didn't read all the emails I received during the weekend. So we love groups more or less like with a diversity. I mean, Italian students mixed with international students if possible, okay? So, when Esposito means I am from the south, luckily or unluckily, from the south of Italy. I teach with Professor Fiori Corporate Governance and Business Administration since 2018. First I worked with him because I am a chartered accountant. Then I decided the crazy decision in my life was to do only the academic, the academic work. So I'm doing a PhD in CSR, in reporting, CSR reporting, and of course the PhD is in economics, with a focus on ESG, and you will study with me CSR and ESG. Okay, today I guess that Professor Fiori explained more or less corporate governance in general, right? Isn't it? Okay, so today we will go through corporate governance structure and system. Of course, I will upload the slides on the system. Okay, first of all, what do you know about corporate governance? I mean, with me, the lecture will be a bit interactive, I guess also with Professor Fiori and also with Professor Marianelli. So what do you know about corporate governance system in general? What is corporate governance? Okay, only the control and manage. Okay, what's your name? Federica come? Sorrentino. Okay, so of course it's C. A kind of, sometimes it's also a system that may give incentives not to the employees, better to the managers, okay? Because they are, the people who manage the company. Then, sorry for this, then I will solve. In your opinion, why there should be this kind of control? Why the control is needed? We said that corporate governance, Federica said that corporate governance, it's a way somehow to have a kind of control. inside the corporate. But why there is this need to control? What's your name? Christine. Okay, and this kind of issue has a name, agency problems, right? So one of the problem that corporate governance tries to solve is the agency problems. Why? Because especially in the large corporation, there is a kind of division between who owns the company and who manage the companies. And this kind of division is called agency problem. Why? Because who owns the company, the shareholders, in general, they have different interests from the ones of the managers. It's better to say that managers in general, they have a different interests compared to the ones of the shareholders. Okay, here you have a kind of definition of corporate governance. Of course, these are the academic definitions. Okay, so we can say that corporate governance is a kind of a set of mechanism to control the company, okay? Or it's a mechanism useful to create bodies that can control the companies inside, okay? Of course, I mean, they are related to the institutional framework of a certain country. We will travel today, you will see the slides, and of course, each country has its own rules related to corporate governance. But it's not only the institutions that can affect how corporate governance may be, but also the cultural, of course, institution, with the term institution, I'm referring to cultural issue, also legislative issues, rules issues, okay? So in general, corporate governance, I mean, it's not only something within the company, but it's affected also by the cultural and institutional context. Okay. Then, of course, you have here what I have just said. So the differences in corporate governance systems are mainly due to different institutional and cultural framework. Okay, we can have also, we can, of course, we can imagine that Indian companies, of course, are different from Italian ones or European ones. I mean, in Europe, you may have some similarities between the companies, then we will study some models. But of course, for instance, the Italian corporate governance model is different from the German one. Okay? So, of course, the institutional framework may influence with all the legislative issues corporate governance system, but also the cultural. I mean, I am into these studies related to the cultural issue because I love this field of study, but in the end, it's not really related to business. Anyhow, cultural issues may affect how corporate governance systems are designed inside a certain company. Okay. Then, Here you have the first division, the first difference to take in consideration. So, first of all, do you know the difference between common law and civil law? I mean, country ruled by common law and countries ruled by civil law. See.
Civil law is mainly used for continental Europe, whereas common law is for English.
I can't even hear you, so I don't know if you can speak.
I would say that civil law is used in continental Europe, whereas common law is used for English-speaking countries, for the US and the UK. And the main difference is that, for example, in common law systems, there is the principle that if the previous sentences are binding.
No, it's impossible to listen to you. So, no, scream no, but I mean, if you can speak a bit with a louder voice, again, the last tentative.
I just said that, for example, civil law is mainly used in continental Europe, whereas common law is English is used in English.
Sì. Yes, you're right. Name?
Giovanni.
Giovanni?
Patari.
Giovanni. Okay, please then write me an email, whoever, has a kind of influence in the lecture. Okay, yes, it's true. I mean, common law, of course, you need to always consider the example of UK and US. Okay, so in general, as far as I understood, because I don't know if I hear you well, you said continental Europe for civil law or common law?
Civil law.
Civil law, you are right, because Germany, Italy also they are countries ruled by civil law. Okay, so common law, you need to remember US or UK. These are the two countries, the two famous countries ruled by common law. Of course, common law means non-codified rules and general rules. General rules means that let's say that each problem is solved case by case, okay? Instead, in civil law countries like Italy, in Italy, of course, civil law, we have the basis like Codice Civile, what we call in Italian Codice Civile, that is the civil code, exactly, that lists all the rules related not only to the business, not only to corporate governance, also rules regarding business administration. Anyhow, Italy, for instance, Spain, in general, Latin countries, they are based on civil law. And of course, civil law means that you have more or less a kind of rule for each issues, okay? Of course, the countries, the common law countries, they are characterized by, they have some characteristics, for instance, a more direct access to the stock market. And this, of course, may influence the corporate governance. I don't know if you, with this few information, you can guess which are the characteristics of civil law countries. Try to guess. Exactly. Name? Pier Giorgio? Mattarella. Okay, Pier Giorgio, yes, exactly. For instance, in Italy, I mean, the ownership is concentrated into the hands of a few families. In fact, the entrepreneurship panorama, the entrepreneurship landscape is characterized by small, medium enterprises ruled by families. Of course, there are some differences also related to regulation, because in common law countries, in general, accounting regulation is in the hands of private agency. So there is a kind of deregulation, if we want to call like this, even if pay attention to this. Stock markets and financial markets in UK and US are very well regulated. Okay, there is an information. There is transparency, and you can trust the information of the financial markets. Okay, instead, for instance, in Latin countries, I'm not referring to Italy, I mean Latin countries like the South of America, it's a bit different, the situation. For instance, you cannot really rely on the information related to the financial market, because there is a strong regulation from one end, but from the other hand, the regulation is issued by the institutions, okay, but there is no real trust in the institution in that countries, okay. In civil law countries, and of course you have the example of Europe and of course Italy, accounting regulation is in the hands of government in general. Okay, so you can rely in general on the information issued by the government. Okay, of course in civil law, then which is how civil law countries can be affected of these characteristics. You said it already, more or less. There is, of course, in civil law, okay, there are more rules, and then if here in common law the situation, let's say, it's more open, okay, which is the situation in civil law countries? More? Okay, but limitation about what? That is the most important thing you need to think about. Okay, and then which is the consequence? Of course, there is a difference between civil law and common law, but let's take it for granted.
Less fluent market, so it's more, I don't know, strict, and capital doesn't flow really well.
Okay, okay. What's your name?
Pierpaolo.
Pierpaolo. Yes, you are right. I mean, here in civil law countries, in general, since you can rely on the information, of course, that circulate in the system, but it's like you have less access to capital markets, okay? And this is the reason why the power then it's in the hand of few people, okay? Also, there are less listed companies, and also there are less. Let's say that in general, the take home for you from this slide is that in general there is less access to capitals. Okay, when I'm referring to capitals, I'm referring to the stock market. Okay, of course, the stock market is a way for companies to finance themselves. Okay, in common law countries, you have a kind of direct access and you have a kind of an easy way to access the capital markets, the stock markets or capital markets, more or less it's the same. And this is the reason why it's more common to find big companies in common law countries. Of course, the big tech are based in US, for instance. See.
Is it not maybe a historical and cultural thing that there are differences not by the legal system? Because the US and the UK got a completely different mindset about risk, and therefore there's a different market situation, not by because of the law.
What's your name?
Oliver.
Oliver. Of course, yes, exactly. Of course, there is an history beyond this division, this difference, because of course, in general, first of all, the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century was in. Where was the Industrial Revolution? In England, in UK. Okay, these of course, I mean, if we have to study the reasons why, we can start today and we can finish like maybe in June. But in the end, of course, there are some historical reasons why common law countries are also less adverse to risk. Instead, here you have countries ruled by civil law that they are, let's say, of course, somehow affected. I mean, they were, for instance, Germany. I don't know if you ever studied history, but there is like the Weimar Republic. So I mean, German people, Germany. I don't know if also Professor Fiori said to you this information, but Germany is very, very, very super afraid. I don't know if there are people from Germany. But in the okay, so you are afraid of inflation, and in general, they are risk adverse. I mean, also to take decision in the boards. I mean, in the board of directors. Then we will see. Of course, it's not a rule. I mean, maybe there are some, you know, like outsider, but in general. I mean, countries ruled by civil law, they are in general risk adverse. And this is the reason why there is more regulation here in countries ruled by civil law than common law countries. Okay, then here you have a list of common law countries and civil law countries. Of course, I mean, you have here England and the United States. I mean, all the US and UK based countries. And here you have, I mean, Germany, France, Italy, and Belgium are the famous one. I mean, the example that in the academia we in general we do. And of course, the strange case could be Scotland, because of course, I mean, you can say, okay, but it's in UK framework, why then is in civil, is characterized by civil law, because, I mean, there is a difference between the two regions, and of course they are ruled mainly by civil law, even if they are in common law framework. Okay, this is a kind of let's say difference we do considering the ownership structure and the capitalism feature. So you have the outsider corporate governance system and the insider corporate governance system. Okay, so which are, in your opinion, of course, it's written already, but I expect from you a kind of, more critical thinking. Which are the main characteristics of the outsider system? Developed. Exactly, and this is the point, the key point also for your presentation. I mean, in the shareholder-oriented system or in the outsider system, in general, companies rely on equity provided by millions of shareholders. So it's what we call a public company, okay? So you have big sharks, or with avoiding the slangs, we have big companies with a dispersed ownership structure, and of course, why you have this dispersed ownership structure? Because there is more access to capital market, because you have then more access to the stock market, and of course, this is the reason why the interest that prevails is the one related to the shareholders. Okay? This is the turning key point also for your presentation. Then you have the insider system that is in general bank-oriented. So who is the actor, the main actor who finance in general the company? The banks. So if the banks invest in the company, of course, it's not equity, but debt. Okay, so you have this bank-oriented system, and of course, companies rely in general on debt, provided by banks or state. Okay, but in this kind of system, the insider system, there is more attention to the stakeholders. Why in the end? Because shareholders are not the main actor. You have here companies, let's say, ruled or where shareholders are the main actors. When I say main actors, I say the principal, character, okay? The most important character inside a company. Of course, they don't rule the company, okay? There are always managers who do that. But when I say, and of course, it's called also shareholder-oriented, mainly because the interest of the shareholders are the ones that count the most, okay? Instead here, there is a kind of attention also to the stakeholders, okay? Is it clear? Of course, here there is a kind of example like the Netherlands, but because it's a mix, okay, it's just for you to know for general culture. But of course, we study this in academia, and it's important also for you because the main difference between corporate governance system, the first main difference is exactly the difference between insider system and outsider system. Okay, the finance, you mean when you, which is the meaning of finance innovation? What are you referring to, finance innovation? You mean like the deregulation? Of course, yes, but of course the deregulation of stock market, guys, it's always something, I mean, if from one end you open the stock market to everyone, and of course all the subjects, all the actors may have benefits about this opening. Of course, from the other end, there are some risky problems. Okay, for instance, it's not in this course, of course, but you will study the failure of Lehman Brothers. I mean, it was exactly because of a kind of stock market deregulation. Okay, so it's okay, the finance, the fintech, let's call like this, innovation, and you are right, because in the end here, the stock market are more developed if we compare them to civil law countries, okay? But of course, in civil law countries, civil law countries can rely more on sustainability and stability, okay? Of course, the price to pay is exactly in the innovation. Okay, here you have another difference. Of course, corporate governance system, you may classify the corporate governance system in insider and outsider system, and then here, one-tier system and two-tier system. One-tier system, you have a single governing body. We will see which is this body later. So, you have one body that is exactly the board of directors that is responsible of oversighting and managing the company. Okay? So you have, again, one body, the board of directors, what in Italian we call CDA, Consiglio di amministrazione, that is responsible for a kind of control and also for managing the company. In your opinion, which are the negative effects of this kind of system? What do you mean? Okay, sì.
Maybe a sort of top-down approach in the both positive but also negative aspects, from the negative aspect perspective is that there is not enough communication, for example, employees and stuff like that.
Okay, no, I have to say no to this. Internally, you can then decide the type of internal communication. It could be whatever. But regarding the control, which is the negative effect? Exactly. That who controls the company is nominated directly from who manage the company. Okay. So of course, this kind of system is typical in common law countries, and let's say that it enhances somehow the shareholders' view, the shareholders-centric model. We will study shareholder view and stakeholder view also during the lecture regarding the corporate social responsibility. I guess you will do the lecture later on with me or Professor Magnanelli, but in the end it's important for you to understand this difference. I mean, in this case, it's related to corporate governance system. Regarding corporate social responsibility and the shareholder and stakeholder value theory, it's another stuff. Okay? See. In reality, there is a kind of compensation committee. We will see in the slides later here. Okay, this is the one-tier system, guys. So you have, it's typical, you have here pension funds, just because it's typical of pension funds. Anyhow, you have here the shareholders meeting, what we in Italian call Assemblea dei Soci, who appoints, nominate the board of directors. Then the board of directors, of course, nominates audit committee, compensation committee, nomination committee. So it's the compensation committee who decide all the compensation for the managers, okay? But of course you are right, because it's inside the board of directors, okay? And the most important take home here of this slide is the audit committee. Because of course, as I don't remember the name, it's a fact that who manage the company nominates who should oversight the company, the audit committee. Okay, so this is the critical factor of the one-tier system. Okay? Sì. Of course, there is a relationship, but of course, you need to know that the salary in US are higher also because of other factors. Because, I mean, the role of unions, for instance, what in Italian we call sindacati, the unions who, in general, they do the interests of the employees. The role of the unions in US is less than here in Italy. I guess that for the international students, of course also for the Italian ones, but I guess that the Italian ones in general, they know something about, you can learn something about the role of the unions, that in the end they influence the corporate governance system. You can read, for instance, the Fiat business case. Fiat case, I mean, before Fiat was part of Stellantis group and was before of Fiat Chrysler, there was a huge crisis here in Italy of a Fiat company, and there was a strong role of unions. So there was like a negotiation between unions and the government. This is the reason why, I mean, the role of the government here in Italy is so important to avoid the Fiat failure during the 80s, as far as I remember. Anyhow, this is the representation of a one-tier system. Of course, the main characteristics are this one, so typical of common law countries, and of course, the focus are the shareholders, okay? Then you have the two-tier system. Two-tier system, I guess that maybe Oliver can help us with two-tier system because it's a German, the typical German model. Anyhow, you have two separate boards. So you have the board of directors, that is what in Italian we call it the CDA, Consiglio di Amministrazione, and you have the supervisory boards, Consiglio di Sorveglianza, okay? In this way, the interests of the stakeholders are more or less, it's like, let's say that they are more important. Okay, so I mean, they have a role also inside the system, and this is the reason why the two-tier system, I mean, it's considered more efficient to preserve stakeholders' interests too. And you have here the main characteristics of the two-tier system models. So, the shareholder meetings, so what we call in Italian Assemblea dei Soci, appoints, nominates the supervisory board. As far as I remember, supervisory board has in German as a name. I mean, because all this I mean, this model is called modello, what in Italian we call modello renano. So Renanian, I don't know how to say it in English, Renanian model, so German model in reality. And supervisory and board of directors, they have a specific name in German because we imported the model from Germany. So you have two boards, the supervisory boards and the boards of directors here. Which are then the main characteristics? Of course, you have the attention towards the stakeholders, okay? Because here you have more attention to the shareholders, but not because the model, I have to say this, okay? Not because the models, because of the rules, because of the market, because of the institutional framework. Of course, all these characteristics influence the corporate governance system, and you have this model, one tier. This other model, German model or Japan model, is characterized by a strong attention to stakeholders' interests and value. Of course, if you have an attention to the stakeholders, which is then, I mean, if you want to do a kind of foreseen, which is then the attention, I mean, is to the short term or to the long term growth? Of course, long term. Why? Because here you have an attention to the stock price. Why you have an attention to the stock price? And to the growth of the stock prices. Why? Why? Again, the question. In one-tier system, you have an attention, let's say, on the short period and then on the growth of the stock prices. Exactly, because if the attention is on shareholders, which is the payoff for the shareholders? Dividends. And this is the reason why in one-tier system model you have then the attention to, let's say, the short term and to the stock prices. Then here you have the attention of the stakeholders, and this is the reason why, let's say, the model have more sustainability, we say, okay? It's more sustainable from a growth point of view, because the growth based on the value of the stakeholders is a growth that is considered more sustainable in the long run, okay? Then, of course, there is also, you know, a kind of influence, cultural influence. I mean, here, one-tier system, of course, as we said, it's typical of countries who can be considered risk adverse. Of course, two-tier system is typical of countries sorry, it's the contrary. I mean, it's this one tier. It's for more risky, who love for country who love risk. Instead, the two-tier, it's completely different, and of course, it's for countries that are considered risk adverse. So, of course, I mean, in macroeconomics, in general, it's a person who can be risk taker or risk adverse, okay, not a country. But to simplify, of course, the cultural issue here, of course, they have an influence on the corporate governance system. Okay, now we can do a small focus on Italy, because of course here we saw one tier and two tier that are, let's say, the extreme part of corporate governance system. Because in the middle there are, you know, like mixed, there could be a mix of corporate governance system like the Italian one. So you have here the shareholders meeting, that is called always Assemblea dei Soci in Italiano, and you have, I mean, shareholders meetings appoints both collegio sindacale, that is, collegio sindacale, guys, unfortunately, or luckily, I don't know, has no translation. But what you need to understand is that collegio sindacale is the Italian supervisory board. What in two-tier system is the supervisory board, here you have the collegio sindacale. That is the supervisory board in Italy, okay? And shareholders meeting appoints also the board of directors. So the peculiarity of this system is that shareholders meeting appoints both collegio sindacale and the board of directors. Okay, so this is the reason why we call it the horizontal two-tier system, because in the end you have anyhow two boards, so there is not just one board, but of course they are nominated both by the shareholders meeting. Okay? Then, which are the main characteristics? First of all, this model, as far as I know, it's used only here in Italy. It's a particular one. And this is the reason why it reflects all the peculiarity of the Italian entrepreneurship system. Why? Sì. Ok. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly, because if in Italy you have a particular situation, what's your name? Stefano? Collevecchio. It's exactly like this. I mean, in Italy we have this particular situation where the entrepreneurship, let's say, panorama, the entrepreneurship landscape is composed by small, medium enterprises, led by families. We have also some big companies, always led by families. Okay, and since in the shareholder meetings there are the family members, I'm referring, of course, with Collegio Sindacale, I'm referring to listed company, okay? Or at least to medium companies, even if they are not listed, okay? But if in the shareholders meeting you have family members, the family members want to maintain the control inside the company. And this is the reason why then they nominate both the board of directors and the Collegio Sindacale. So that, of course, they continue to maintain the control. Of course, in the meantime, transparency sometimes could be, you know, like an issue in this case. But then you will study, I don't know if with me or with Professor Magnanelli, you will study all the solutions for this, to maintain transparency for this model. For instance, the introduction of an independent director. Also, in the one-tier model, there was the introduction of the independent directors. I don't know if you have already talked of this issue about, I mean, with Professor Fiori. No, not yet. Okay, anyhow, there are some, you know, solutions to solve this lack of transparency. But of course, I mean, the take-home of this slide is exactly that, I mean, this model reflects all the characteristics of the Italian business panorama, okay? So, of course, there is also the presence of the public sector. When I mean public sector means government, because in general here in Italy it's the government who somehow participates into the big companies. Okay, for instance, Eni, I mean the main shareholders of Eni, as far as I remember, is the Ministry of Economy or CDP, I mean one of the two, but in general, if you look to the shareholder structure of the big Italian companies, in general, I mean, there is the high presence of the government. Okay? Questions about this? Okay. I will give you just an overview about about the main characteristics of the corporate governance system. Of course, I mean around the world. Anyhow, you need to fix in your mind this difference. I mean, of course, this difference, because it's the first difference. So insider and outsider system. And then here you have, of course, another difference. So one tier and two tier system. You need then, between the two-tier system, you need to consider then the Italian example, okay? That is a kind of horizontal two-tier system. Okay, now, in your opinion, of course, we already talked about, but more or less, if you want to give more details about, how is the corporate governance model of US? Before I'm showing the slides. Which are the main characteristics of the corporate governance system in US? Non mi ricordo il nome. I remember only the surname because it's the important one currently. I don't remember the name. Pier Giorgio. Okay.
Should be on outside the corporate governance system and the law.
Exactly, but then let's do another reflection. Let's do another reflection about the shareholders. Let's do a reflection about the stakeholders, which is their role. Exactly. Okay, and so if let's say the main way to finance are the shareholders, how is how the shareholders meeting is composed? There is always a majority and minority. You need to think about also the access to the stock market. If you have the direct access to the stock market, which is then the consequence inside the shareholder meeting in general? Exactly. Then you will see with Professor Magnanelli which is the problem about the majority, about the minority stakeholders, shareholders, sorry. But in general, you have a more dispersed shareholder composition, okay? That is completely different from Italy, where you have, let's say, a kind of status quo composition of shareholders, okay? Of course, because in general you have more access to the stock market. So here in the United States, first of all, there is again a single board because US it's equal to one-tier system, okay? Of course, shareholders in general, they have a significant power, including all the issues about the vote. You will study them during further lectures. Then you have, of course, market-driven governance. Why? Because, of course, if you have more access to the stock market, to the capital market, of course, the rules, more or less, are done by the market and not by the government. Then, please, attention to this, the last bullet point, because here it's written that US, they have a strict regulation for transparency. It's not a strict regulation related to the civil law. It's a strict regulation for transparency, for managing this open access to the capitals. It's related to the information in the stock market. It's related to how this information can flow through the market. Okay, but it's not related to the presence of the government in the economy and in the business. Is it clear? Because otherwise, at the exam, maybe the question may be, okay, but which is the role of the government in the common law countries and in the US system? Okay. Regulatory environment in this case doesn't mean that the government is inside the economy, because we will see then the example of China. I don't know if are there any Chinese students. Okay, so maybe you can teach us, you can teach me, but there is more presence of the government there, okay? And in this case, the regulation is about the stock market, only the stock market. Of course, there are interventions inside the economy, okay? But from a corporate governance point of view, we say that, of course, there is a strict regulation inside the stock market to regulate the access to the capital, okay? Then here you have UK. Of course, UK is designed more or less to the basis of US system. So you have more or less the same characteristics. Of course, you have the one-tier corporate governance model. Again, there is the emphasis on transparency, but also here there is the emphasis on transparency, because in general, the regulatory framework in general improves or tries always to improve transparency in the stock market. And this is the same more or less also here. Then you have institutional investors that in general they play a large role, and they sometimes they have also an active role with managers. Okay. When we refer to institutional investors, we are not referring again here to the government, to the intervention of the government inside the company, okay? We are referring to big investors, okay? So in general, here and here you have the intervention of big investors inside the companies, okay? Like for instance, investment funds, pension funds, okay? Then we have Germany. So, again, you have here two-tier system model. So you have, these are the name, Vorstand and the other, I cannot pronounce it anyhow. So you have here the separation. You have the supervisory board and you have then the management board, okay? So we are into two-tier system. In general, as I told you, two-tier system is characterized by an attention to stakeholders. So this is the reason why sometimes employees, they have a seat in supervisory boards. And of course, the approach is the long-term approach. again, the approach is a sustainable one, and this is the reason why you have here stakeholder approach. So you have a balances interests of shareholders and stakeholders. Guys, pay attention to the fact that okay, German model, let's say that it has attention to stakeholders, but not only to the stakeholders. I mean, the shareholders are always the ones who owns the company, okay? So, of course, there is a balance between shareholders' interest and stakeholder interest. Okay, then of course, long-term orientation and sustainable growth. Then here you have Japan. Japan model is a very particular one. Anyone from Japan? No, only Chinese. Okay. Why? Because it's the two-tier system. So, Japan model is always characterized by two-tier system. I told you, sorry, here. So the two-tier system, German model or Japan model, but they have, you know, a kind of interesting characteristics that is the Keiretsu system. Keiretsu means that the big sharks, I mean the big companies, they have a cross-participation in each other's, okay? So the ownership in this way, how is the ownership in this way? Yes, it's a kind of mixed, but only between all the big companies, you know? So you have a kind of interlocking shareholdings participation between, of course, a business group. And this, of course, has a consequence from if we study the entrepreneurship landscape of Japan. Why? Why, in your opinion? No, okay for this. I mean, let's take it for granted that there are few, not families in reality, but few people who owns participation, you know, cross-participation in each other. But then which is the consequence from a business point of view? Do you remember what happened with Mediaset and Vivendi? Do you know the story about the takeover, the hostile takeovers between Vivendi and Mediaset? Do you know it? Okay, it was like a few years ago, there was a kind of hostile takeovers because Mediaset, for the international students, Mediaset is a media, let's say, company here, listed company, of course, a family-based and family-found company, and Vivendi is the French competitors. Vivendi acquired some stocks. I don't remember exactly all the issues, but there was a kind. I mean, the Italian family who has the majority of the shareholders, of the shares, sorry, is the Berlusconi family, who was losing Mediaset for the hostile takeover of Vivendi. Now, which is the direct consequence of the Keiretsu? If the ownership of the big companies is a cross ownership with the Keiretsu system, of course, this way avoid the hostile takeovers. I don't know if you are used to these hostile takeovers, but in general, I mean, in the US, it's more frequent to hear about hostile takeovers. Here in Italy, there were some famous cases like Mediaset and Vivendi, but I mean, since in Italy there is the protection of the ownership, in general, it's more difficult to find, you know, like a situation like the hostile takeovers. Anyhow, Keiretsu system could be a way to avoid, okay, situation like hostile takeovers and the kind of, I mean, it's a way to maintain again the status quo. Of course, here also in Japan there is the involvement of the government, but as you can see, is different from the US government intervention. Here is in the stock market, okay, and it's in order to regulate the stock market. Here instead, sorry, you have the government that influence corporate governance reforms, but not only, because sometimes it has also, you know, like participation in the big company. I mean, the situation is similar to Italy, okay? Then, South Korea, you have this particular system, okay, you have a large family-controlled conglomerates. It's more or less like Italy. I mean, in general, more or less the situation, again, they have family firms, and of course, the more you have small, medium enterprises, the more you have family firm inside the entrepreneurship landscape, the more you have problems with transparency, okay? But the model that is different from the ones we discussed about is the China one. I don't know if one of you here can more or less show us the China corporate governance model. Which are the main characteristics, first of all? Of course, there is a big intervention of the state, because the government is directly involved inside the companies. Of course, currently, correct me if I am wrong, there are some reforms related to transparency. Of course, you have, I mean, there are also political issues related to the corporate governance committees, but in general, it's just for you to understand that here the entrepreneurship landscape is characterized by big companies, but mainly controlled by the government state. Is that correct? No? Are there any family also? Okay, so let's try to explain which are the main characteristics then of China model. First of all, one tier, in your opinion, it's just your opinion, one tier or two tier system? If you would like to explain. Okay, so then civil law is a two-tier system. Okay, and then which is the entrepreneurship landscape in China? For instance, in Italy, it's characterized by small, medium enterprises where the families have the main role inside the corporate governance. Yes. Exactly. Okay, yes. But let's say that in the infrastructure sector, so I mean in sectors in key sectors like energy or transportation, I mean it's the government, let's say, who more or less who rules. Instead, of course, the situation is completely different here in US or UK. Of course, all these characteristics, they have an influence inside the corporate governance system. I guess that there is the last example here with India, where, India is a very particular example because you have a kind of, if you have any question, you can raise your hand. Okay, so you have family firms, not family firms, but families who in general own businesses. So you have many companies that are controlled by founding family, like in Italy, from one end, but from the other hand, there is a kind of development of let's say, the institutional investor role. And I guess that this is happening also in China, as far as I know. So also in China, there is the growing attention to the institutional investor role, okay? So there is a kind of let's say, openness to the institutional investors. And the problem here is in the corporate governance code. Why? Because it's voluntary and sometimes, and there is in the end less transparency. So whenever the problem exactly is in the transparency, because here the more transparency you have, the more you are obliged to follow the rules, okay? Even if there is more market deregulation. Here you have less transparency, sometimes also in Italy more or less could be the same. Here you have less transparency, but of course the government intervention, there is a kind of growth in the government intervention for the rules, okay, not in the economy, to establish some rules, okay, for the access to capital. Okay, any questions? Then you have finally the Russian case for, let's say, for Par Condicio. But anyhow, this is not the topic for the next presentation. In the next presentation, you need to underline the stakeholder view and the shareholder view. I guess that Professor Fiori, during the first lecture, explained to you stakeholders view and shareholders view, right? Okay, so based on that information and continuing on the information related to the corporate governance structure, you need to build a presentation, okay? So, of course, you can study the issue from whatever point of view. I mean, you can mention also corporate governance, and you can also give some example. Sorry. Of course, not the examples that are in these slides. So just for you, for your understanding, the last example is the Russian one. So you have, okay, the control is in the hands, I mean, this is, let's say, a picture before the war. So, I mean, of course, now the situation is a bit different. There are some differences. Of course, just for you, this is a general framework, and the ownership is in the hands, not in the hands of the family, but in this case, I mean, there is a state control a bit different because there is an oligarch control, of course. Then you have here weak minority protections. You will study the minority issues with Professor Magnanelli, but it's just for you to know that in an ownership structure there is the majority of the shareholders and the minority of the shareholders, and in general the state issues some protection and some rules for the minority shareholders, okay? Of course, here in Russia there is a less protection towards the minorities. Of course, here there is transparency also. There are transparency issues, and of course there is a kind of political, more than political intervention, I would say government intervention inside the economy. Okay, any question, especially because the take-home of these slides is this one. I mean, outsider and insider system, and then one-tier and two-tier system, and the characteristics of the one-tier and two-tier system, and also the two-tier horizontal system, that is the Italian one, the Italian example. Questions? Sì. You mean in the one-tier system? Okay. No, but it's not, the problem is not the development. I mean, yes. No, it's not that one-tier system is, guys, this is important. This is an important point. Successful, you mean regarding the performance, the financial performance. Okay. We didn't mention, I didn't mention the financial performance. I mean, it's not that the one-tier system leads to a better financial results and the two-tier system lead to bad financial results. The two systems, of course, according to the legal framework they work in, of course, they can lead to a certain performance, but we don't know anything about the performance. There are some studies, you will study them with some papers, that link the good results with the good corporate governance. But good corporate governance is both, is one tier or two tier, depending